Energy is produced in cells by something that we call cell respiration, and there's three different types, but I want to just go back to the basics first. So all cells in the world, whether you're a human cell, a bacterial cell, or a plant cell, need energy to survive and function. That's why you need food. That is why you would die without food, because food makes energy, and energy is called ATP. And depending on the environment you're in, there's three different things that cells can do to make ATP, to convert food like sugar into energy, ATP. There's aerobic respiration, which is the most efficient way for cells to produce energy, and it uses oxygen. There's anaerobic respiration, and this doesn't use oxygen and happens when cells either don't have access to oxygen or are in environments where there's no oxygen. And then there's fermentation, which is another way cells can make energy without oxygen, but it makes very little energy, only makes 2 ATPs. So the end goal of all of these processes is to make ATP, which is the energy that powers everything that cells do, from when like you're sick and your body's trying to heal you, or you need to run, or anything, or for your heart to pump. So starting with aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is the process that uses oxygen, it's aerobic, to break down glucose into ATP. It's the most efficient way for cells to produce energy, and it makes the most ATP, around 36 to 38 ATP per glucose. Most organisms like humans, bacteria, use it to produce energy. And aerobic respiration has three main stages. There's glycolysis, there's the Krebs cycle, our favorite, and there's electron transport chain, which is where the most where oxygen comes into play and the most ATP is made. So that's aerobic cell respiration. Prokaryotes and eukaryotes can do this, humans and bacteria. Then there's anaerobic respiration. When you put an before a word, it means not. So anaerobic means not aerobic. So this happens when cells don't have access to oxygen. Some bacteria, like prokaryotes, can do anaerobic respiration. Human cells, we cannot. We can do fermentation, which is an anaerobic process, but now I'm talking about anaerobic respiration. So this is where the bacteria can metabolize different things like iron and sulfur. That's why bacteria can grow everywhere, because they can break down these things and make energy. And we'll have its own lesson on that. And then finally, we have fermentation. Fermentation is a way for cells to make ATP without oxygen. Fermentation actually happens in human cells, like human muscle cells, and bacteria and yeast. It happens in human cells like when you're doing intense exercise. So when you're doing intense exercise and your cells cannot keep up with aerobic respiration, your muscle cells can start doing anaerobic respiration. Other types of fermentation are things like lactic acid fermentation. So going back to muscle cells produce lactic acid, and this is what causes that burning sensation when you work out really hard. There's also alcohol fermentation. This happens in yeast and produces alcohol and carbon dioxide, which is used to make like bread and alcoholic beverages. Fermentation is the least efficient to make energy because it only produces 2 ATP, but it's very quick and it keeps the cell going when oxygen isn't available. So fermentation is kind of like a backup battery when we think of eukaryotic human cells. So in summary, cells need to do different types of respiration to make energy, to make ATP, and this is breaking down things like the sugar, glucose, food into energy. There's aerobic respiration, and it uses oxygen, and it produces the most ATP, 36 to 38. There's anaerobic respiration, which does not use oxygen and produces less ATP, between 2 to 36. And then there's fermentation, which also doesn't use oxygen, and it only produces 2 ATP for every glucose molecule. So each process has its place depending on the cell's needs and the environment that it's in. But no matter which one of these is used, aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration, or fermentation, the goal is always the same, and it's to make ATP, to make energy, because without energy, you can't make new cells, you can't get better when you're sick. So for example, the reason that you're told when you're sick that you should rest and not do anything. It's so all that energy that you make, that ATP can go to your immune system rather than going to like mental stuff like anxiety, depression, or like running or anything like that. So when you're sick, it's so essential to rest so that when your cells are making ATP, they're using all that ATP to power your immune system. And there's a million other things to think of this. Sometimes people also study this in cancer and like how are cancer cells doing metabolism? Do cancer cells change aerobic respiration? Is there any difference? Are they pumping out more ATP? So that's where metabolism comes into play. And I'll make a separate video on each one explaining them in detail. So explaining Krebs cycle and aerobic respiration. And don't get lost in these terms like glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, mitochondria, cytoplasm. The goal of all of these is just to tell you, how do cells take food and convert it to energy, ATP. That's where all these terms come into play. So I just want you to keep in mind the big picture.